we are going to be talking about the Less CSS preprocessor. So in modern web development, it's very, very common for you to not write your styles in pure CSS, but to write them in a language that is then compiled into CSS. Now, the reason for this is CSS has been a very, I guess you could say, stagnant language. The actual core CSS language has not changed dramatically really ever. I mean, there's a couple new language features that have been added, you know, in the 2 and the 3 specification, but in general, the language itself is very straightforward. And the unfortunate thing about that is, since we're not getting, you know, awesome new different structural features to the language, some tasks in CSS become very, very difficult and I guess you could say very repetitive to do. So some awesome people have gone out and created their own languages that look like CSS and might even be directly compatible with straight up CSS, but have additional features that make writing your styles easier. So generally what you'll do is you'll pick one of these sort of CSS superset languages, and you'll download their compiler, and you'll write in that language, and then have the compiler translate into CSS, and then have the browser load that CSS. So this adds an additional compilation step to our website authoring of necessarily, because we're no longer writing in a language that the browser can understand. I'm ignoring the fact that some of these preprocessors, Less included, allow you to run it on the browser itself, but I highly, highly discourage doing that, except for in the cases where you're trying it out. I highly encourage that instead people put together a build step that will compile it. And one of the reasons why I want to talk about Less, in particular, it's very, very important, I believe, that in modern web development we use CSS preprocessors, be it Less or Sass or what have you. And B, it also shows us kind of why it's important to have a build step and to use a tool like Gulp, for example, at all. So we're going to see when we start talking about Gulp how we can use Gulp to make authoring Less a lot easier. But before we do that, we kind of have to introduce the actual language itself. So in the next 2 videos, we're going to be talking about that. In this video, I just want to introduce Less, what it is, what it does, and compare and contrast it with the other CSS preprocessor that's also very popular, and that is Sass. So basically, like I said, I encourage everybody to start using CSS preprocessors because it'll make your life a whole lot easier for like 0 cost. But you're gonna have to choose between which one you want, and the 2 big ones are gonna be Less and Sass. And the difference is Less, I think, has a much easier syntax getting started with. It's much more similar to CSS, as we're going to see, and a lot of the things that it does uses just straight up what looks like CSS to begin with. Whereas Sass, some of the features, such as the mix-in features and all that stuff, required some additional syntax, and it's a little bit more complicated in other ways. Now, fortunately, while Less is a great one to get started with, it'll be very easy to go from Less to Sass if you decide to do that. Now, I'm not going to be introducing Sass in this series or talking about its syntax very much, but I just want to let you know that you know, if you get comfortable with Less, you'll be able to transition to Sass pretty straightforward. Another plus for Sass, besides being a little bit more advanced and having more features, is that it is faster. It now has a C compiler. Historically, Sass was written in Ruby, and there still is a port of the C compiler in Ruby if you want a pure Ruby environment, which is kind of one of the reasons, I guess, why Less kind of took off more in the JavaScript community, because Less is written in JavaScript, and Sass took over the Ruby community. Now, the Sass preprocessor is substantially faster with its C compiler compared to Less's JavaScript compiler, so stuff and things. Popularity is definitely picking up on Sass. One of the biggest libraries that uses a CSS preprocessor, Bootstrap, has moved from Less to Sass recently. It's definitely something to check out, but I chose Less for this series primarily because A, it's simpler, and B, the tooling for Less is a lot easier in a JavaScript environment, although that is changing now that Sass is starting to gain popularity outside of the Ruby community. Anyway, let's go ahead and install Less and see how we can use it. So I'm going to basically start off a project. We're going to get the project kind of going real fast in this video, and then we'll flesh it out in the next video with some awesome stuff in it. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm in an empty folder, and I'm going to start off by doing my just general npm init. Just go ahead and leave all the defaults, don't really care, yes. And then I'm gonna go ahead and install Less. So now I have a package.json file, but it's, of course, has no dependencies. I'm gonna go ahead and do npm install Less, and then I'm gonna save dev. Now, the reason I'm saving dev is that one of the ways that you might preprocess your Less is that you compile your Less before you commit up to your repository, so that a production environment won't have to have Less installed in order to do its thing. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter, and we'll give it a sec to download itself and all of its dependencies. And it is downloaded. So as you see, it has quite a few dependencies. So I'm going to go ahead and open up code, and let's talk about how we can use Less to compile a Less file into a CSS file. Then what we're going to do is we're going to use the npm scripts to make that process just a little easier for example purposes in this video and the next one. So to start off, I'm going to need a .less file. So I'm going to go ahead and hit a new file, and I'm going to do site.less. And inside of site.less, I'm just going to go ahead and put in a really simple rule just so we can get some output. This is a rule that I want to use for the example site that we're going to be putting together. So I'll just do HTML, comma body to select both HTML and body, and I'll give them both a height of 100% and a margin of 0 and a padding of 0. So this will just serves as a really straightforward Less file that we can compile and make sure that our little build pipeline is going to work right. Now, how do we compile it? Well, there's a couple ways. We could write a Node script that actually loads in the Less compiler into a Node runtime, because Less is written in JavaScript. Or we can use a command line utility that comes with the Less package. And we can see that by opening up Node modules and seeing the bin folder, and we see the Less C command. We also see a bunch of other commands that got pulled in from dependencies of Less C, but we're not worried about those. All we care about is Less C. So to compile this file, all we got to do is reference that script. So node modules /bin less c, and then I'm going to pass in site.less and hit enter. Now, the output that we're going to see is we're going to see the Less preprocessor preprocessing this site.less file, and it's going to dump it straight into our terminal or our command line. To make it print out to a file, I'm going to go ahead and hit the up arrow so I can use this command again. We simply pass in a second parameter. In this case, I'm going to do site.css. Now I'm going to hit enter, and now we see no output. However, if we come back to code, site.css has appeared in our directory. And if I click on that, we see that it's been preprocessed. Of course, it's almost the exact same with the exception of that additional new line, because we're not using any of Less's features yet. But we can see it properly compiling here. Now, I don't want to keep on typing this all the time, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this into an npm script real fast. So jumping over back into code, opening up my package.json, and locating my scripts property, I'm going to remove this test from it, and I'm just... did not mean to... Stop it. There we go. I'm going to go ahead and add a new script here, and I'm going to call it styles. And the script is simply going to be less c space site less space site.css. And then if I come here and delete site.css, and then come back to my terminal or my command line, I can type in npm run styles, and I can see that site CSS got generated again. So again, it's just a nice little thing. Remember, you do not have to fully qualify the bin directory when executing a shell or command line script from a npm script. Anyway, all pretty straightforward. We now have Less installed. Of course, this is not how we're going to be executing Less once we introduce Gulp. The whole thing about this course, one of the biggest things about this course is doing a build process, and in the future we're going to have other tools like like Gulp or Browsify or, not Browsify, but Webpack actually go out and do the compilation of Less for us. But here I just want to introduce the language. And I think that's what we're going to do in the next video. So, I guess we'll see you then.